All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to do a deep dive into something I find super fascinating, and I think our listeners will too. We're going to look at Augusta National.
Okay.
Specifically, we're going to look at the greens, and we're going to look at them through the lens of some really interesting source material that we have here.
All right.
So we've got, first off, we've got these things called green books,
Mm-hmm.
and one in particular from a company called Line. And then we're also going to reference a section from a book called Augusta National's Greens. And, just to be clear for the listeners, these aren't just like, pro tips from Golf Digest or something.
Wow.
These are serious, like, deep dives into,
Yeah.
yeah, the real nitty-gritty of these surfaces.
Yeah, and these green books, I mean, they're so sought after, and they were so accurate that they were actually banned from use during the Masters
Really?
back in 2022.
Wow.
So that kind of gives you a sense of how
Like, these are really powerful tools.
the real deal.
Yeah.
Okay, so our mission here today is to basically kind of unpack what makes Augusta's greens so unique, so challenging. And we're going to go beyond just, oh, they're fast,
Right.
they're sloped. We're going to see how all those elements combine in this really unique way to create a very special type of challenge for golfers.
Right.
And hopefully along the way, we can learn a little bit about how we might see these same principles in action on, maybe our own home courses.
Exactly.
So, okay, let's jump in. So first, let's talk about these green books. I'm just fascinated by this. What is in these things?
So basically, imagine like a blueprint, a super detailed blueprint of the green
Okay.
that shows you every little contour, every little change in elevation.
Okay.
And so it gives you a very precise understanding of how the ball is going to break.
Oh, wow.
And like I mentioned earlier, they're just incredibly accurate.
Okay.
So accurate, in fact, that, they were banned.
Wow. Because, it's not, I guess it wasn't really in the spirit of how the tournament wanted to be played.
Right.
They wanted players to, rely on their own experience and their own judgment.
I mean, it's pretty amazing that something as, like, simple as just a map could be so powerful, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So I'm looking at some excerpts here, and the thing that really pops out at me is the color coding. Can you explain a little bit what those colors mean?
Yeah, so in these green books, green and blue typically represent areas of the green that are relatively flat.
Okay.
So those are the kinds of areas that you would see as being kind of commonplace on typical PGA Tour events.
Gotcha.
What you notice about the depictions of Augusta is that there's a lot more pink and red.
Oh, okay.
And those colors indicate areas of the green that have much more severe slopes.
I see.
So, it's really the prevalence of these slopes combined with the fact that the greens at Augusta are so fast
Right.
that makes them so challenging.
Right. It's not just the speed or just the slope. It's the...
It's a combination of both, yeah.
Okay, interesting. So, I mean, that kind of leads us to a bigger point that we want to discuss today, which is sort of Augusta's design philosophy and this concept of what we're calling the binary choice. Can you kind of set that up for us?
Yeah, so, if you look at most golf courses and how they're designed, players have a lot of different options in terms of where they can aim their shots.
Right.
They can aim for the middle of the green, and even if they miss a little bit,
Yeah.
they're usually going to be okay.
Right.
But Augusta is very different.
Okay.
Almost every hole at Augusta is designed in a way that forces players to make a very specific choice.
Okay.
So, it's not like they can just kind of aim for a general area and hope for the best.
Right.
They really have to pick one of two options.
Okay.
And those options are usually very clearly defined.
Okay, so it's like option A or option B.
Exactly.
And there's not a lot of room for like option C.
No, not really.
Okay, so so that has a huge impact on approach shot strategy, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
We were talking about this idea of like budgeting for misses on a normal course.
Right.
How does that play out at Augusta versus, what we see on a normal course?
Yeah, so, on a typical course, players can aim a little bit conservatively.
Right.
They can aim for the middle of the green, and even if they miss a little bit, they probably could be okay.
Right.
But Augusta is very different.
Okay.
The greens are so sloped and they're so fast
Right.
that even a slight miss can lead to a very difficult putt.
Right.
And, we see that a lot with players who are new to Augusta.
Okay.
They often make the mistake of thinking that they can play it like a normal course,
Yeah.
and they end up getting into a lot of trouble.
So basically, that whole strategy of just like
Doesn't work.
playing for the middle of the green
Doesn't work.
just doesn't work.
Yeah.
Okay. So why is that? What makes Augusta so unforgiving?
Well, like I said, it's really the combination of the slopes and the speed.
Okay.
Um, you know, the greens at Augusta are some of the most undulating greens in the world.
Right.
And we have some data to support that.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's that Golf Digest study from, what was it,
Oh,
1980?
no, 1988, yeah.
Something like that.
They did a computer model of the greens at Augusta.
Oh, wow.
And they found that the 10th hole, for example,
Mhm.
plunges over 100 feet from the tee to the fairway.
Oh, my gosh.
So, I mean, that's a huge amount of elevation change.
That's a lot, yeah.
And, and you combine that with the fact that the greens are actually relatively small.
Okay.
They average about 6,400 square feet.
Okay.
So there's just not a lot of room for error.
Right. So it's like even small misses
Can lead to big problems.
can come to big problems.
Exactly.
Okay. And then on top of that, we've got the speed.
Right.
And we were talking about, how fast the greens are at Augusta now,
Yeah.
and then how they've gotten faster over time.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, back in the 1970s, the greens at Augusta were measured at about 8 on the stimp meter,
Okay.
which, for reference, that's about as fast as a typical public course might be today.
Okay.
But today, the greens at Augusta are consistently in the range of 15 or 16 on the stimp meter.
Okay. So that's like,
Twice as fast.
yeah, that's a huge difference.
That's a huge difference.
Okay. And I remember seeing this calculation from putting Coach Ralph Bauer
Yeah.
about like literally whether a ball will stop.
Right.
Can you explain that?
Yeah. So he came up with this formula where you take the slope percentage
Yeah.
and you multiply it by the stimp meter reading.
Okay.
And he said that anything over roughly 39 and the ball is unlikely to stop.
Okay.
So, even a seemingly gentle slope
Yeah.
on a green that's running at 15 or 16 on the stimp meter
Right.
can suddenly become treacherous.
Wow. Okay, so how does that that calculation tie back into the gun books?
Well, if you look at the green books,
Yeah.
you'll notice that pin positions are very rarely placed on slopes that are greater than 4%.
Okay.
And that's because, at Augusta's speed,
Right.
anything steeper than that,
Yeah.
and the ball is just not going to hold.
Right. It's just going to keep rolling.
It's just going to keep rolling.
Okay. So we've got these incredibly sloped greens.
Mm.
We've got these incredibly fast greens.
Right.
And this leads to this really interesting concept that we were talking about, which is effective green size.
Yeah.
Can you explain what that means?
Yeah. So, when you look at a golf green,
Yeah.
you can see the total square footage of the green. But that doesn't necessarily tell you the whole story.
Right.
Because, at Augusta,
Yeah.
a lot of that green is not actually playable.
Okay.
So the effective green size is the area of the green where a ball is actually likely to stop
Okay.
and give you a reasonable chance at a putt.
Gotcha.
And at Augusta, the effective green size can be much smaller than the actual green size.
Right, because so much of it is just like,
Slope.
yeah, slope.
Yeah.
Okay, so can you give us a specific example? Like, imagine you're facing a 30-foot putt.
Mm-hmm.
How does that effective green size come into play there?
Yeah, so, 30-foot putt on a typical green.
Yeah.
That's a relatively straightforward putt for a professional golfer.
Right.
But at Augusta,
Yeah.
that same 30-foot putt,
Yeah.
if it catches the wrong slope,
Yeah.
could easily roll another 30 feet.
Wow.
Or even off a green entirely.
Right.
And that's because the greens are just so fast.
Right. Yeah.
And they're so sloped.
So, like, you hit your 30-foot putt,
Yeah.
and then, suddenly you're 60 feet away.
That's
And
right.
now you're in a totally different situation.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so that's really interesting. So, with these incredibly small, effective targets,
Mm-hmm.
how do players actually approach their shots into these greens?
Yeah. So, because of the challenges posed by Augusta's greens, players often adopt one of two main strategies.
Okay.
The first strategy is what we're calling option A.
Yep.
And this strategy is basically about playing it safe.
Okay.
It involves aiming directly at a very small, relatively flat portion of the green.
Gotcha.
And the goal here is to just avoid the slopes altogether.
Okay.
So even if the putt is a long one,
Yeah.
at least it's going to be on a manageable surface.
Okay, I see.
And then the second strategy is what we're calling option B.
Okay.
And this is the more strategic and often riskier approach.
Yeah.
It involves intentionally using the slopes to your advantage.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So a player might aim for a particular part of a slope,
Yeah.
knowing that it will then feed their ball towards the hole
Gotcha.
or towards a specific flat area.
I see.
And, you know, the key thing to remember here is that the right option can change from day to day,
Yeah, that makes sense.
even for the same hole,
Right, depending on the pin.
depending on the pin placement. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so to really see these strategies in action,
Mm-hmm.
let's look at some specific hole examples.
Okay.
Let's start with maybe the most famous hole at Augusta, the 18th.
Right.
How does option A versus option B play out there?
So the 18th green has a very pronounced slope
Mm-hmm.
from back to front.
Okay.
And typically on Saturday,
Yeah.
the pin is placed on a relatively flat section
Okay.
at the back right of the green.
Okay.
And in this scenario, option A is usually the preferred strategy.
Okay, why is that?
Well, because any shot that ends up short of that back right plateau
Yeah.
is likely to roll a significant distance down the slope.
Right.
And that's going to leave a very difficult uphill putt.
Okay.
So players will often aim directly for that flat area
Gotcha.
just to avoid the consequences of being short.
Okay, I see.
Now, on Sunday,
Yeah.
the pin is typically located on a small flat area on the front left of the green.
Okay.
And this is where option B comes into play.
Okay.
Because of the slope behind the hole,
Yeah.
players can actually aim their approach shots past the pin
Oh, interesting.
and use the slope to feed the ball back down towards the hole.
Okay, so you're using the slope to your advantage.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
And, we've seen some famous examples of this.
Yeah, I was going to say, haven't some Masters been won that way?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, whoa.
So Sandy Lyle, Phil Mickelson, Adam Scott,
Okay, yeah.
all won their Masters with birdies on the 18th hole on Sunday by using that option B strategy.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So, okay, so we've got the 18th hole.
Mhm.
Let's look at another one.
Okay.
How about the 6th hole?
Right.
That's a really interesting one.
Yeah. So the 6th hole is a great example of how the effective green size can be much smaller than the actual green size.
Okay.
Visually, it's a large green.
Right.
It's about 7,500 square feet.
Okay.
But when the pin is in the back right position,
Yeah.
which is where it typically is on Sunday,
Right.
the effective green size becomes incredibly small.
Okay.
And that's because of the slope around that pin.
Right.
Any shot that misses to the left or short of that pin
Yeah.
is likely to roll a long way away.
Right.
And we saw that with Scottie Scheffler in 2022.
Yeah, what happened?
So he hit a shot that ended up about 30 feet left of the pin.
Okay, yeah.
But because it missed the flat area around that pin,
Right.
it ended up rolling 70 feet away. So, that's just a really good example of how
Like what looked like a good shot
it was a decent shot.
became a terrible shot.
Yeah.
Oh.
So, for that back right pin position,
Yeah.
option A is often the preferred strategy.
Okay.
Players have to be much more aggressive than they might normally be.
Okay.
And they have to aim directly for that small, flat plateau.
Right.
And it's a risky shot.
Yeah.
But the alternative is often a very difficult putt.
Right.
So, we saw Tiger Woods use that strategy in 2019.
Oh, really?
He aimed right at the pin,
Wow.
and he ended up making birdie.
Nice.
So, it's a very difficult shot,
Right.
but sometimes it's the best option.
And there was also Sam Wyman, right? He was
Yeah.
talking about the putts.
Yeah. So, a lot of people think that the downhill putts at Augusta are the most difficult.
Yeah, you would think,
Yeah.
because they're so fast.
Yeah, but Sam Wyman actually said that he found the uphill putts to be even more difficult.
Really?
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, he said that because the slopes are so severe,
Mm-hmm.
even going uphill,
Yeah.
you have to hit the ball much harder than you think you do.
Really?
And he said that he found himself leaving a lot of putts short.
Wow.
So, it just goes to show that the greens at Augusta are very difficult,
Right.
no matter which way you're putting.
Wow. So you really have to know what you're doing.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got the 18th hole.
Mm-hmm.
We got the 6th hole.
Mm-hmm.
Is there Is there one more hole that you want to highlight?
Yeah, let's talk about the 16th hole.
Okay.
So the 16th hole is a par 3,
Yeah.
and it's over water,
Right.
and it's a very famous hole.
Yeah.
And it's also a great example of how the pin placement can really dictate the strategy.
Okay.
So when the pin is on the right side of the green,
Yeah.
most players will opt for option A. They'll aim conservatively to avoid the big slope on the left side of the green,
Okay.
which can send the ball a long way away.
Gotcha.
But when the pin is on the left side of the green,
Yeah.
which is where it typically is on Sunday,
Okay.
option B becomes the preferred strategy.
Okay.
Players will often aim at the slope to the right of the pin,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that it will funnel the ball down towards the hole.
Okay.
And that's why we see a lot of holes in one on that pin position.
Oh, interesting.
Right.
Because it's kind of acting like a backstop.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So, so taking a step back,
Mm-hmm.
we've talked about all these incredible challenges that the
Yeah.
greens at Augusta present.
Yeah.
Why is this so important? Like, why should our listeners care?
Well, I think it's important because it really shows you how much thought and strategy goes into playing golf at the highest level.
Right.
These guys aren't just going out there and hitting the ball as hard as they can.
Right.
They're really thinking about every shot.
Right.
And they're using their knowledge of the course
Okay.
to their advantage.
Okay.
And I think there are some lessons that we can all learn from that,
Yeah.
even if we're not playing at Augusta National.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things that I always tell my students
Yeah.
is to pay attention to the slopes on the green.
Okay.
Don't just aim for the middle of the green.
Right.
Think about where the ball is likely to stop
Yeah.
and use that to your advantage.
So really, like, think about that effective green side.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And another thing that I think is important is to not be afraid to be aggressive.
Okay.
Sometimes the best shot is the risky shot.
Right.
And if you're not willing to take some chances,
Yeah.
you're never going to shoot really low scores.
Okay. So, just to kind of bring it all home,
Mm-hmm.
Augusta's greens, they're really a masterclass
Yeah.
in golf course design.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, they're challenging.
Yes.
They're beautiful.
Yes.
And they're just really special.
Yeah, they're iconic.
So, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think it's really important to think about the courses that you play,
Okay.
and to look for those little nuances
Yeah.
that can make a big difference.
Okay.
Are there any slopes on your home course
Mm-hmm.
that you can use to your advantage?
Right.
Are there any greens that are particularly fast or slow?
Right.
The more you understand about the courses that you play,
Yeah.
the better you're going to be able to score.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, I think that's really the beauty of golf,
Yeah.
is that there's always something new to learn.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what keeps it so interesting.
Absolutely. Well, this was a fantastic deep dive.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you walking us through all this.
My pleasure.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening.
And we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.